Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. Today, we're going to touch on part 3 of the introduction to identity governance. We're going to keep it pretty simple today. So what are you going to learn? We're going to touch on some of the basic access control models, touch on some of the strategies, considerations, and account groups. So that's what we're going to cover today. It's all going to be under entitlements. As you can see, we're going to look at entitlements and Cyvergence services. So a bit of housekeeping. Obviously, this is the third part of an ongoing series in identity. It's not intended to be a complete overview. I do recommend seeing the first and second parts of the series prior to today's presentation. So let's touch on entitlements. We're going to jump into access control models because this is kind of a foundation for how are you going to look at entitlements and what are the processes. So think of these, and they're much more than that, but is sort of the philosophical underpinnings for how you're going to approach access control. And there's more that we're going to cover on that. But these are slightly academic. For those of you who do have your CISSP, the cybersecurity certification, you will note that this is common for what you need to do. Now, for those who are in the military, a lot of these are much more applicable. You're going to see them more often, but you do see them occasionally in different types of applications. And so these are just different approaches that one can take. So let's take a look at the BIBA integrity model. It's primarily used for secret, top secret, and dealing with the different levels of classification. So you have the simple integrity model, and that's basically not reading down. Then you have the star integrity property. We're not allowed to write up. So you're writing down to the level so other people can read it as appropriate. And then when you're talking about the integrity, they can't read anything further down. So that's part of what the challenge is with the BIBA model. Let's go ahead and jump into the Graham-Denning model. It's about confidentiality through authorization. And this is pretty simple. You have subjects and you have objects. You have certain users who are able to gain access to certain things. And the access modes are pretty simple. This is create, destroy, read, and write, generally speaking. There's the Clark-Wilson model, which focuses also another data integrity model. But what it does, it's looking at the subjects, the objects, and the program. And so what happens is with the right people having the right systems are able to make what's called a well-formed transaction within the Clark-Wilson model. And that's how it ensures data integrity. So you don't have unauthorized changes going on because they're all authorized. It's not a perfect model, like none of them are, but at least from an integrity standpoint, this is how they approach it. There's Bell LaPadula. Again, this is another way of taking a look at things within the military space. It's about controlling access to classified information levels, getting into the secret and top secret. Now, you will note that the simple integrity property and the star integrity property are the same as what's found in BIBA, but their functions are different. So there's no read up as opposed to read down and no write down. So it's a little bit different. It's just from an opposite perspective. So this is the integrity property where you can't read up, so you can't read beyond what you're supposed to be able to read, and you can't write down. And that's their way of enforcing integrity. Again, this is just one area to look at within access control models. But let's take a look at some of the strategies that are used within organizations. There's RBAC. Now, this tends to be what most companies kind of strive for in the best of all possible worlds. Now, typically organizations don't meet that, but you have things like role-based access controls. This means a role is going to have access to certain things. Now, in the best of all possible worlds, this would be the human resources roles. So the roles are being created, and then you can accomplish anything that you want to within that role. And that's how RBAC is set up. Now, a lot of challenges that you run into are typically the roles start to change or run away, or they slide and shift all the time. So the access starts to get a little bit messy, especially over a period of years. You might start with something small like, oh, we'll take care of that later. And then it oftentimes doesn't get done. But that leads to discretionary access control, especially if somebody who's gaining more responsibility. They've moved around several times within the organization. They might have too much access. That's where discretionary access control comes in. And that's part of that whole process. Generally speaking, it's not considered that secure because how do you review it? How do you make sure that the information in there is appropriate? and the access is the way that it needs to be done. So that's where discretionary access control comes in. Then you're going to find attribute-based access controls. This is where you've got an appropriate attribute in order to gain access to something. So this can be either a policy or a claim is where this comes in. So this would be, hey, there's an end user who needs to look at something, and they're given authorization to do that because they're looking at claims, and an application may say, yep, this person's on the phone, they validated their address, and therefore they have access to be able to do what they want to do. And there's different variations of these that are out there, but that's just one example. And then you have mandatory access control. This is where everybody has the same access, and it's based on the type of information. So a good example of this that I think everybody's aware of is a website. Generally speaking, if you're talking about a plain text website with no authentication, everybody's going to have access to that whole website, especially if it's an information-only website. And so because of that, that's considered a mandatory access control, though many of us are not sitting down and thinking we need mandatory access controls, because usually it's intended to be a little bit more specific. There's also multi-level security out there. So this is where you have labels of objects and users to grant access. So you might tag an object, you might tag a user, then you have a matrix for what they can gain access to. And that would be the way that you implement a multi-level security environment. Again, this is a little more common in applications, but it's just a general strategy that some companies and some applications where this may be applicable to, and some companies start to work down. Of course, break the glass is very important in many organizations. You might have, say, an emergency account that's set up, especially if you are concerned about a local site may not have what's called Active Directory to be able to connect into. And if you don't, and it doesn't have access to a cloud, you might need a local account to make the changes. So then you're going to need a way to gain access to it. And a break the glass account is a good way to do things, because a lot of them are set up where you have to connect into some sort of centralized directory, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's a local system within an environment. There's lots of approaches that you can take. So some entitlement considerations here. So there's permissions. Permissions are a big thing. So, what are you able to do? And this is getting into more modern operating systems, and typically how you find it today within Windows and some of the other things. You can have things like read, write, execute. You can grant or revoke access, create or destroy objects. That's where a lot of the power comes in when you're considering permissions. And so you might consider some of the things that we've talked about previously also to be permissions. But it's one of the things that when you're starting to look at entitlements, what should somebody actually have access to? Have you actually mapped out the different access control groups, and are you getting done what needs to get done? Geolocation. This is a big one, especially if you're in the incident response space. So let's say somebody needs to log in from Seattle, and 10 minutes later, you see them logging in a different country. That's a problem. Obviously, they don't have the access that they should have access to in that particular case. And so you might decide to limit where they have access to. And so some of the systems that are out there do prevent that access. There's also a detection. If you can't prevent it with the systems that you're working with, you have a detection capability, but we'll start to touch on that a little later in a different presentation. You can also grant access to specific systems. Like, I want you to access these 50 systems or these 100 systems and no more. So that does take a little extra time to do, but for some organizations, it's a great way of going towards something called zero trust, which will be the subject of another conversation. Time is another thing for entitlements. Are you entitled to go and log in 24/7, 365? Or do you want to allow people only access during specific points in time? So this is the way a lot of organizations work, is they will limit it. So if you've got, say, account representatives and they're only going to be working 8 hours a day and they're by contract can't work more, they might cut them off at a certain point in time and say, you can only work from, say, 9 to 6, and we're blocking everything off after that. Just-in-time access. This is where you would create an account where they would gain access only for the period of time when they need to for a specific resource. So that just-in-time access might include permissions when you're looking at that. but it's also very much time-based. So this is another time-based control for looking at entitlements, and that can be part of the consideration when you're providing access to individuals. There's also account groups. They're very common in many organizations, and they help determine access overall. So you might say, well, the customer service reps, they're going to gain access to all the customer service systems that are out there. The customer service systems. You're not going to allow them access to the IT systems, which the administrator would have. And there's different types of groups. So LDAP, remember I talked about the Windows, Active Directory, and Entra, but LDAP is the fundamental building block of that. It's very common. Something called Open LDAP is used on the Linux systems. So this is part of what you should consider. There's also local access to administrators and power users and a bunch of other different types of accounts as well without going too deep in that. Sudo is used within the Linux world for enhanced administrative level access. So you don't give them everybody full access who happens to be on the system. The sudo is a way to, within a particular user, get that extra level of access. And you have to have access to the file in order to modify it in order to grant the appropriate level access for the users. So these are just a few of the entitlement considerations. And this is going to be more important when we start to do a deeper dive later on. But it's just a few things to consider when you're looking at this whole entitlement process, when you're looking at the access that people have. That's the whole point of everything that we're covering today. So we'll briefly take a look at the Cyvergent services. We help with identity program building, assessments, identity tool selection. There's a lot that we can do here. But if you need any help on any of these, please let me know. Reach out. Let's have a conversation. You can follow us on YouTube. If you find these videos helpful, let me know. Or LinkedIn. I tend to post these out as well. But I want to thank you very much for showing up today. And I look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Thank you so much.